At first glance, nothing appears unusual. There has been no declaration of war, no emergency session at the United Nations, no evacuation orders for civilians. Markets are open, flights are still operating, governments are issuing calm statements. And yet, behind the scenes, behavior is changing, not dramatically, not publicly, but consistently. In geopolitics, rhetoric is often misleading. What matters more is behavior, and in the last several days, multiple systems that rarely move together have begun to shift at the same time. Military logistics, energy transport, diplomatic positioning, strategic messaging. Each change on its own would be unremarkable. Together, they form a pattern, and patterns matter, because systems do not reposition themselves without reason. One of the earliest signals came not from politicians, but from defense planners. Advanced missile defense assets were quietly placed on higher readiness. Naval formations adjusted their operating zones. Air patrols expanded their coverage envelopes. No adversary had announced an attack. No red line had been publicly crossed. And yet, preparation accelerated. This is not how governments behave when they believe stability is holding. It is how they behave when they believe time is compressing. The next signal came from a place most people don't watch: insurance. Marine insurers quietly adjusted risk premiums for vessels transiting key Middle Eastern waterways. Shipping companies began altering routes, not because of conflict, but because of probability. Oil continued to flow, but at a higher perceived cost. This matters because markets are indifferent to politics. They respond only to risk. When markets flinch before governments do, it usually means something is being priced in. Perhaps the most revealing shift has been what hasn't been said. Normally, periods of rising tension are accompanied by aggressive messaging, threats, warnings, posturing. This time language has become restrained, carefully worded, legally cautious, ambiguous. That kind of restraint is not de-escalation. It is option preservation. When leaders stop speaking clearly, it's often because clarity would limit their next move. At the center of this pattern sits Iran. The country is under immense internal strain. Its economy has been battered. Its population has shown unprecedented unrest. Its leadership has responded with force rather than reform. From the outside, Iran appears weakened. Historically, that is when pressure increases. But something unusual has happened. Instead of isolation tightening, support has arrived. Quietly, technically, deliberately. No alliance treaties were signed. No joint press conferences were held. Instead, military cargo aircraft began appearing on Iranian runways. Repeatedly. These were not symbolic visits. They were logistical. And logistics tell the truth. Strategic airlift is used for one purpose: to move high-value assets quickly, air defense components, radar systems, command and control equipment, items that are defensive by nature, but decisive in effect. Russia and China are not acting out of charity. Their involvement is calculated. For Russia, supporting Iran complicates Western military planning at a time when Moscow wants to stretch US attention and resources. For China, the Middle East represents energy security, trade routes, and a testing ground for global influence beyond the Pacific. Neither country needs Iran to win a war. They only need to ensure that any intervention becomes costly and uncertain. That is how deterrence works in the modern era. Not by threatening retaliation directly, but by reshaping the battlefield in advance. The assumption that is no longer safe for decades, a core assumption, underpinned Western strategy toward Iran. If necessary, Iran could be struck. That assumption was never casual, but it was stable. It relied on air superiority, technological advantage, predictable escalation dynamics. Those conditions are changing. Advanced air defense systems do not prevent conflict, but they change its tempo. They slow it, complicate it, increase the margin for error. And when error becomes likely, political appetite for action declines. The United States now faces a narrowing set of options. Apply pressure and risk escalation across multiple theaters, restrain itself, and risk emboldening adversaries. Neither option is clean. Neither option restores stability. And that is precisely the problem. Why this moment is different. This is not a repeat of past standoffs. It is not 2012. It is not 2018. It is not even 2025. Iran is weaker internally, but stronger defensively. The United States is powerful, but constrained politically. Russia is disruptive. China is patient. And all four are operating inside the same compressed time frame. No one is asking this publicly yet, but it is being debated privately. Is this still about preventing Iran from doing something? Or is it about preventing a new balance of power from settling into place? Because once that balance hardens, reversing it becomes far more difficult. If you want more analysis like this, grounded in systems, incentives, and real-world behavior, like the video and subscribe to the channel. It helps keep this kind of long-form reporting alive. To understand where this goes next, we need to examine how Iran survives pressure, why it invested in indirect power rather than direct confrontation, and why the tools that once kept escalation in check are no longer working reliably. That requires looking at architecture, not headlines. And that's where we go next. To understand why this situation feels so difficult to resolve, you have to understand how Iran learned to survive. Not to win wars, not to dominate rivals, but to endure pressure long enough that others lose patience. That lesson was not theoretical. It was learned through trauma. In the 1980s, Iran fought an 8-year war with Iraq. It was brutal, indecisive, and devastating. Hundreds of thousands were killed. Cities were bombed. Chemical weapons were used against Iranian troops. And for much of that war, Iran stood alone. From Tehran's perspective, the message was clear. When Iran is isolated, no one intervenes to save it. That conclusion would shape Iranian strategy for decades. After the war ended, Iran's leadership reached a strategic conclusion. They could never match the United States or its allies, tank for tank, ship for ship, or aircraft for aircraft. Trying would be futile. So they chose a different approach. Avoid direct confrontation. Avoid symmetrical warfare. Avoid decisive battles. Instead, build resilience. Iran stopped thinking in terms of traditional military dominance. Instead, it invested in architecture. Not one army, but many pressure points. Not a single battlefield, but multiple theaters. This architecture had several defining features. Dispersed, no single point of failure. Indirect, plausible deniability at every level. Incremental, escalation without commitment. Persistent, pressure that never fully stops. The goal was not victory. The goal was leverage. What the West often calls proxies, Iran views as insurance. Armed groups embedded inside other states serve a specific purpose. They move the battlefield away from Iranian soil. Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, Yemen. Each location adds distance between Tehran and direct retaliation. Each creates uncertainty for adversaries. And uncertainty is deterrence. For many years, this strategy worked. The United States responded selectively. Israel struck tactically. Escalation remained bounded. Both sides believed the other wanted to avoid full-scale war. That belief acted as a brake. But brakes wear down. At the same time, Iran was building patience. The United States was accumulating fatigue. 2 long wars, trillions of dollars spent, limited public appetite for new conflicts. Over time, American strategy shifted from dominance to deterrence, from intervention to restraint. This did not signal weakness, but it did signal constraint, and constraint creates opportunity. When red lines are clear, behavior is predictable. When red lines blur, testing begins. In recent years, Iranian-aligned forces have repeatedly tested limits: attacks on US bases, harassment of shipping, missile launches calibrated to avoid mass casualties. Each incident asked the same question: how far can pressure go before response becomes unavoidable? For a long time, the answer appeared to be further than expected. Strategic restraint can preserve stability, but it carries risk. If restraint is misinterpreted as indecision, deterrence erodes. Adversaries begin to adjust expectations. Pressure increases. This is not escalation by intent. It is escalation by interpretation. The nuclear variable enters the system. Overlaying this entire dynamic is the nuclear question. Iran's nuclear program has long existed as a strategic hedge, not necessarily to build a weapon, but to remain close enough that others must calculate carefully. As agreements weakened and oversight diminished, that hedge grew more valuable. Every crisis now carries a nuclear shadow. Strike too hard, and incentives to weaponize increase. Restrain too much, and leverage grows. There is no clean equilibrium. This is where Russia and China become decisive. Their involvement does not change Iran's intentions. It changes Iran's confidence. Advanced air defense systems, intelligence sharing, political cover in international forums. These do not guarantee safety, but they complicate intervention. They stretch timelines, increase uncertainty, raise the cost of decisive action. And cost is often what stops decisions from being made. At this point, every major actor is operating under pressure. Iran feels existentially threatened. The United States feels credibility slipping. Regional allies fear blowback. Global markets fear disruption. Each actor believes delay favors someone else. That belief narrows options. From the inside, escalation often feels manageable. Each step is justified. Each response seems measured. Each decision feels reversible. History shows otherwise. Most major conflicts do not begin with deliberate choices. They begin with accumulated pressure and one miscalculation. Iran's strategy was designed to avoid war. Ironically, it now risks enabling one. The same architecture that provided resilience has created persistent friction, and friction, over time, generates heat. The question is no longer whether deterrence exists. It is whether deterrence can still absorb shock. In the final phase, we confront the most difficult question of all. What actually happens if deterrence fails? Not in theory, not in policy papers, but in real time, across markets, militaries, and societies. Because if this system breaks, it will not break quietly. If deterrence fails, it will not fail loudly. There will be no formal declaration, no singular moment that clearly marks the transition from tension to war. Instead, failure will arrive as a sequence of decisions, each one defensible on its own, irreversible in combination. This is how modern conflicts begin. The most likely trigger would not be intentional escalation. It would be miscalculation, a strike that kills more people than intended, a missile that lands in the wrong place, a response that comes faster or harder than expected. In systems already under strain, small deviations matter. Once that threshold is crossed, leaders no longer debate whether to respond. They debate how much. And that debate happens under pressure. If conflict begins, the opening phase would be fast and opaque. Air operations would precede explanations. Cyber disruptions would appear before attribution. Markets would react before clarity emerges. Military planners would prioritize speed, suppress air defenses, disrupt command and control, protect forward forces. The objective would not be regime change, it would be containment. But containment requires cooperation, and cooperation would not be guaranteed. Iran would not attempt to match US capabilities directly. That has never been its strategy. Instead, Iran would aim to widen the conflict without formal escalation. Pressure without ownership. This would likely include activation of regional partners, disruption of maritime traffic, missile launches calibrated for signaling, cyber operations targeting infrastructure. Each action would be deniable. Each would increase cost. Each would test resolve. The intent would not be victory. It would be leverage. The Strait of Hormuz would become the central variable. Iran does not need to close it. It only needs to introduce uncertainty. Insurance premiums would spike. Shipping schedules would collapse. Energy markets would react immediately. This is not hypothetical. Markets respond to risk, not outcomes. Even temporary disruption would ripple globally. Inflation would rise. Supply chains would tighten. Political pressure would spread far beyond the region. War would be felt economically before it is understood strategically. For US partners, the moment after escalation would be the most destabilizing. Israel would face direct threat from multiple fronts. Gulf states would confront retaliation risks. European governments would face energy insecurity and political division. What began as a bilateral confrontation would become multilateral by default. Not by choice, by geography. Neither Russia nor China would need to intervene militarily to shape outcomes. Their leverage lies elsewhere. Diplomatic cover, intelligence sharing, material support, narrative framing. They would call for restraint publicly, while privately benefiting from Western distraction. Their objective would not be escalation, it would be dilution. Dilute American focus, dilute alliance cohesion, dilute the idea that power can be applied cleanly. In modern geopolitics, slowing an opponent can be as effective as defeating one. Even without nuclear weapons being used, the nuclear dimension would immediately reshape incentives. If Iran absorbs strikes while remaining non-nuclear, the lesson is clear. Restraint did not prevent vulnerability. That lesson would not be lost in Tehran or elsewhere. States do not pursue deterrence because they want war. They pursue them because they want to prevent it. Conflict changes that calculus rapidly. Throughout this process, leaders would tell themselves they are managing escalation, that responses are calibrated, that lines are still visible, that off-ramps remain. History suggests otherwise. Escalation rarely feels out of control, until it is. By the time leaders realize options have narrowed, decisions become reactive, and reactive decisions are rarely optimal. Beyond missiles and markets lies a slower cost. Trust erosion, institutional fatigue, political fragmentation. Wars reshape expectations. They harden narratives. They reward extremes. They make compromise appear weak. Even short conflicts leave long shadows. What makes this moment different is not hostility. It is structure. A region dense with weapons. A global economy tightly coupled to energy flows. Great powers testing limits without direct confrontation. These systems amplify small shocks, and amplification is what turns incidents into crises. As of now, deterrence still holds. Channels still exist. Signals are still exchanged. Restraint, however thin, remains. But restraint depends on perception. And perception is shaped by confidence. Confidence is what systems lose first. So what happens next? That depends on decisions being made quietly, not publicly. On whether leaders accept imperfect outcomes over irreversible ones. On whether pressure is relieved before it compounds. On whether the system bends or breaks. History offers no guarantees, only patterns, and the pattern here suggests that the most dangerous moments are not marked by drama, but by normalization. When escalation becomes routine, when risk becomes familiar, when no single step feels decisive until the sum of them is. If this analysis helped you see the structure behind the headlines, like the video and subscribe to the channel. This story isn't over, and the next chapter may arrive without warning. The real question is not whether conflict is possible. It's whether the system still has enough margin left to prevent it. That answer hasn't been written yet, but the conditions that will decide it already are.